For a decade, they presented a united front of disapproval, a stone wall of tradition against which Sumit and Jenny's love repeatedly crashed. We saw the tears, the threats, the emotional ultimatums. Anil and Sahna Singh, the immovable objects. But behind the scenes, a quiet mutiny was brewing, a subtle shift in the tectonic plates of family power. And the unlikely instigator, the master strategist who saw a crack in the wall and patiently worked to widen it, was none other than Jenny Slatten herself. For years we thought the battle was between Jenny and Sahna, a clash of cultures and wills. But the real war, the one that truly mattered, was for the heart and mind of one man, Anil Singh. And Jenny, it seems, was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. This is the story you haven't been told. The exclusive theory pieced together from insider reports and a careful re-examination of the evidence. If you want to dive deep into the real stories and the hidden strategies behind 90 Day Fiancé, you need to be here. Before we pull back the curtain on this incredible power play, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell. You are not going to want to miss a single detail of how Jenny orchestrated one of the most brilliant psychological maneuvers we have ever seen. To understand the genius of Jenny's campaign, we must first rewind. We must immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of the Singh household as it was for years, a veritable fortress of familial opposition. The narrative we were sold, and the one Sahna tirelessly promoted, was simple. Jenny was the homewrecker, the older American woman who had bewitched their son, Sumit, and was tearing their family apart. Every argument, every tear, every ounce of drama was laid squarely at her feet. And for the longest time, Anil stood right beside his wife, a silent but stoic partner in this campaign of disapproval. He was the patriarch, the head of the household, and his word, even when unspoken, carried immense weight. When Sahna would launch into a tirade, Anil would be there, his face a mask of stern agreement. When family meetings were called to pressure Sumit, Anil was a key participant. He was, for all intents and purposes, Sahna's chief lieutenant in the war against Jenny. They were a single, unified entity, the parents. Their strategy was one of overwhelming force, constant emotional bombardment. They leveraged guilt, tradition, and the threat of social ostracization. They made it clear that Sumit's choice was not between Jenny and another woman. It was between Jenny and his entire family, his entire history, his entire identity. We all remember the scenes. Sahna collapsing with grief, declaring she would rather die than see her son marry Jenny. The threats of disownment, which were not idle but carried the very real threat of cutting Sumit off from the family support system that is the bedrock of Indian society. Anil, in those moments, was the enforcer. His silence was his power. He didn't need to scream and cry like Sahna. His quiet, simmering disapproval was perhaps even more terrifying for Sumit. It was the disappointment of a father, a powerful weapon in any culture, but especially potent in a patriarchal one. This united front seemed impenetrable. How could Jenny, an outsider with no allies and a limited understanding of the intricate family dynamics, ever hope to breach it? For years, she tried the direct approach. She argued back. She tried to defend herself and her love for Sumit. She would engage with Sahna, matching her passion with her own, trying to make her understand. This, we can now see, was a fatal error. Arguing with Sahna was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. It only made things worse. It fed the drama, validated Sahna's narrative that Jenny was a disruptive force, and forced Anil to double down on his support for his wife. Every time Jenny raised her voice, she was proving Sahna's point. Every time she fought back, she was the aggressive foreigner, the disrespectful interloper. She was losing, and losing badly. The more she fought, the more isolated she and Sumit became. And then something changed. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic event. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in tactics. This is where our insider reports begin to paint a new picture, a picture that the cameras may have missed. According to a source very close to the family, who observed the dynamics within the home over a long period, Jenny came to a profound realization. She could never win a direct war with Sahna. Sahna had the home field advantage, the cultural weapons, and a lifetime of experience in emotional warfare. To continue fighting on Sahna's terms was a guaranteed loss, so Jenny changed the battlefield. She stopped fighting altogether. This was the first step in her brilliant long-term strategy, the cessation of hostilities. When Sahna would start an argument looking for a fight, Jenny would simply refuse to engage. She would become quiet, respectful, almost deferential. She would absorb the insults without returning them. She would listen to the tirades without offering a defense. To an outsider, it might have looked like surrender. It might have seemed as if Jenny had finally been broken, that she had given up. But this was not surrender. This was a strategic retreat. This was psychological jujitsu. By refusing to fight back, Jenny took away Sahna's power. A person like Sahna thrives on conflict. It is her oxygen. When Jenny stopped providing that conflict, Sahna was left screaming into a void. Her dramatic outbursts, once a powerful tool to rally the family against the enemy, now started to look like what they were: the rants of an unreasonable woman. The enemy was no longer fighting back, so the general of the army was left looking shrill and hysterical, while the supposed enemy looked calm, poised, and mature. This created the first tiny crack in the parental alliance. Anil, a man who, by all accounts, craves peace and order, was now witnessing his wife's emotional storms without the justification of an ongoing battle. The chaos in his home was no longer a two-way street. It was a one-woman show. And for a man exhausted by a decade of conflict, this shift in perception was monumental. The source of the stress in his home was no longer Sumit and Jenny. It was increasingly, undeniably Sahna. But Jenny didn't just stop at a ceasefire. That was only phase 1. Phase 2 was the charm offensive, but not the kind you think. She didn't try to win over Anil by convincing him she was the perfect wife for Sumit. She didn't try to debate him or win him over with logic. Her approach was far more subtle, far more elemental. She focused on Anil not as a father-in-law, but as a man who was tired, stressed, and feeling unheard in his own home. This is where the quiet mutiny truly began to take shape. Our insider describes a new routine forming in the Singh household. Jenny, the quiet observer, started to notice Anil's daily habits, his moments of quiet frustration. She saw him sitting alone in the mornings or in the evenings, his face etched with the weariness of the day's battles, both at work and at home. And she began a simple yet profoundly effective ritual. She started bringing him tea. Now, in our Western culture, this might seem like a small gesture, but in India, the serving of chai is steeped in tradition and meaning. It is a gesture of respect, of care, of service. It is what a daughter or a dutiful daughter-in-law does for the head of the household. For years, Jenny had been cast as someone who rejected these traditions. By embracing this simple act, she was communicating non-verbally. She was saying, "I respect your position. I see you. I am here to serve, not to disrupt." Imagine the scene. Sahna is in another room, perhaps complaining on the phone to a relative or stewing in her own anger. The house is thick with tension, and into this tense environment comes Jenny, moving quietly, holding a steaming cup of perfectly prepared chai. She approaches Anil, not with a demand, not with an argument, but with a simple offering. She would place the tea before him, perhaps with a small nod, and then she would do the most important thing of all. She would leave him in peace or sit quietly, expecting nothing in return. She wasn't doing it to start a conversation. She wasn't using it as an opening to plead her case. It was an act of pure, unconditional respect. Day after day, this ritual was repeated. The morning tea, the evening tea, a silent contract of civility began to form between them in the spaces where Sahna's rage couldn't reach. For Anil, a man living in a constant emotional tempest, these quiet moments of peace, delivered by the very person who was supposed to be the source of the storm, must have been like a lifeline. It was a moment of calm, a moment of normalcy. It was a moment where he was simply a man being respected in his own home, a feeling he was likely getting less and less from his own wife, who was consumed by her singular obsession. This tea offensive, as we'll call it, was the foundation, but the true masterstroke was what came next, the listening campaign. After establishing a baseline of quiet respect, Jenny slowly, cautiously began to engage Anil in conversation. But again, her method was pure genius. She never, ever talked about Sumit. She never talked about her relationship. She never defended herself or criticized Sahna. The one topic that was the source of all conflict was completely off the table. Instead, she talked about him. Our source details how Jenny would find Anil in his moments of repose and ask simple, disarming questions. "How is your day at work, Papaji? Is your health okay? You seem tired. Is there anything I can get for you?" These were not the questions of an adversary. They were the questions of a caregiver, a concerned daughter. She positioned herself as someone who was worried about his well-being. She shifted the focus from her own problems to his. This was a radical change in the household dynamic. For years, all the emotional energy in that house had been directed at the Jenny and Sumit problem. Jenny, in a brilliant move, redirected that energy toward Anil himself. She made him the center of her attention. And what happened when she asked these questions? Anil, a being who likely felt like his only role in the family drama was to be a silent enforcer for his wife's will, finally had someone who was willing to listen to him. And not just listen, but listen without judgment. He would begin to talk. He would complain about the stress. He would talk about his health, his blood pressure, the constant fighting that was taking a toll on him. He would vent his frustrations about the chaotic home environment, the endless cycle of anger and tears. And Jenny would just listen. She would nod sympathetically. She would offer words of comfort, but always carefully phrased. She would say things like, "That sounds so difficult. You must be exhausted." Or, "I'm so sorry you have to deal with all this stress. It's not good for your health." Notice what she's not saying. She's not saying, "Sahna is driving you crazy." She's not saying, "Your wife is the problem." She never blamed Sahna directly. That would have been a mistake. It would have forced Anil to defend his wife, and the wall would have gone right back up. Instead, she validated his feelings. She made his stress, his exhaustion, his suffering the main issue. She was a sympathetic ear, a shoulder to cry on, for the man who had no one else to turn to. Think about the psychological brilliance of this. She was creating a secret emotional alliance. In these quiet conversations, they were two people, trapped in the same stressful environment, finding a moment of shared humanity. Jenny wasn't the cause of his stress. She was the person who understood his stress. She was the calm port in the storm of his own life. The person causing the storm, the person creating the drama he was complaining about, was his wife, Sahna. Jenny never had to say it. Anil was connecting the dots himself, day after day, one cup of tea, one quiet conversation at a time. This was the divide and conquer strategy in its purest form. For a decade, the narrative was Anil and Sahna versus Sumit and Jenny. A clear 2 versus 2 battle. Jenny systematically dismantled that narrative. She slowly, patiently, extracted Anil from his wife's side and repositioned him as a neutral party and eventually a fellow victim. By becoming his confidant, she subtly reframed the entire conflict. The problem was no longer Jenny. The problem was the drama. And who was the primary engine of the drama? Sahna. Let's analyze the contrast she was building in Anil's mind. On one hand, he had his wife, Sahna. Her interactions with him were likely filled with demands, complaints about Jenny, and pressure to maintain the family's opposition. Conversations with her were about the problem. She was a source of constant, unending stress. She was emotional, often irrational, and her presence meant the conflict was always front and center. Her love and respect were conditional, tied to his allegiance in her war. On the other hand, he had Jenny. Her interactions with him were calm, respectful, and centered on his well-being. Conversations with her were an escape from the problem. She was a source of peace and quiet sympathy. She was poised, patient, and her presence offered a respite from the conflict. Her respect, demonstrated through her actions, appeared unconditional. She wasn't asking him for anything. She was simply giving him something he desperately needed, a moment of peace. This campaign likely took months, perhaps even years, to fully bear fruit. It was a war of attrition, a slow and steady erosion of Anil's loyalty to his wife's cause. Jenny was playing the long game. She understood that a man like Anil would not be won over by a single grand gesture or a persuasive argument. He would be won over by consistency, by a sustained pattern of behavior that proved she was not the monster his wife made her out to be. She was proving through her actions that she was a stabilizing force, not a destabilizing one. Every time Sahna had an outburst, it pushed Anil further away. Every time Jenny brought him tea, it pulled him closer to her. It was a slow, inexorable transfer of allegiance. Not a dramatic betrayal, but a quiet, pragmatic shift. Anil, tired of the fighting, tired of the yelling, tired of the emotional blackmail, began to see a different path forward, a path of least resistance, a path toward the peace and quiet he craved. And that path was paved by Jenny. It's crucial to understand that Jenny likely wasn't trying to make Anil love her or even fully accept her. The goal was more strategic. She didn't need him to be her biggest fan. She just needed him to stop being Sahna's biggest soldier. She needed to neutralize him. By positioning herself as his ally in the quest for a peaceful home, she effectively convinced him to lay down his arms. He wasn't defecting to her side. He was simply abandoning his wife's war. He was declaring himself a conscientious objector. This is the very heart of the theory. Jenny didn't win Anil over. She wore him down. She didn't defeat Sahna in a direct confrontation. She simply made standing with Sahna more exhausting than standing down. She presented Anil with a choice, not between his son and his wife, but between chaos and calm. And Anil, after a decade of war, chose calm. He chose the quiet sympathy of the American woman over the relentless fury of his own wife. We need to consider the cultural context here, which makes Jenny's strategy even more audacious. In a traditional Indian family structure, the daughter-in-law's role is one of deference to the mother-in-law. The bond between a mother and son, like Sahna and Sumit, is considered paramount. And the husband-wife bond, like Anil and Sahna's, is expected to be a united front to the rest of the world. Jenny systematically and covertly subverted all of these norms. She bypassed the mother-in-law and forged a direct, personal connection with the patriarch. She created a fissure in the husband-wife alliance. She turned the traditional power structure of the Indian family on its head, and she did it so quietly, so subtly, that they didn't even realize what was happening until it was too late. Sahna was so focused on the overt battle, on winning the arguments and staging the dramatic confrontations, that she completely missed the covert war being waged for her husband's soul. While she was screaming on the front lines, Jenny was sneaking into the command tent and winning over the general. It was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. Sahna had the bigger army, the cultural high ground, and the family support. But Jenny had a better strategy. She had patience, she had emotional intelligence, and she had a deep understanding of her target, a tired old soldier who just wanted the war to be over. This theory recontextualizes so many of the scenes we've witnessed over the past few years. Think about the moments where Anil seems disengaged while Sahna is at her most hysterical. We might have interpreted that as simple exhaustion or tacit agreement. But what if it was something more? What if it was a quiet internal dissent? What if behind his weary eyes he was thinking, "Here she goes again. Jenny would have just brought me some tea and left me alone." His silence was no longer a sign of solidarity with his wife. It was the silence of a man who had already checked out of the fight. The evidence for this shift from theory to reality is not found in a single dramatic declaration from Anil. He never turned to Sahna and said, "You are wrong, and Jenny is right." That would be too confrontational, too out of character. The proof is in the small rebellions, the tiny cracks that started to appear in the once unbreakable wall of his and Sahna's unity. It's in the moments where he stopped being her silent enforcer and started being a quiet moderator. We started to hear him say little things, phrases that would have been unthinkable in the early years. During one of Sahna's rants, we might hear a quiet, "Sahna, leave her be," or "Sahna, that is enough." These were not robust defenses of Jenny. They were pleas for peace, but in the context of this family, a plea for peace was a de facto defense of Jenny because it was a direct contradiction of Sahna's desire for war. He was no longer co-signing her aggression. He was now trying to de-escalate it. And who was the beneficiary of that de-escalation? Jenny. Every time Anil dampened his wife's fire, it was a small victory for Jenny's campaign. It was proof that her strategy was working. He was now seeing Sahna's behavior as the problem, not Jenny's existence. He was treating the symptom, which was his wife's rage, rather than attacking the supposed disease, which was Jenny. Then came the more significant shifts. The family astrologer, a figure of immense authority, gave a lukewarm blessing to the marriage, with conditions. In the past, Sahna might have used this as a tool to forbid the union entirely, focusing on the negative. But Anil's newfound passivity, his desire to simply end the conflict, likely meant he wasn't going to back his wife in another dramatic, all-out fight against the astrologer's word. His war weariness gave Sumit and Jenny the opening they needed. His inaction became their most powerful weapon. We saw this culminate in Sumit and Jenny finally getting married. It happened, not with the family's enthusiastic blessing, but with their grudging, exhausted acceptance. And a huge part of that acceptance was Anil's retreat from the battlefield. Without her number one soldier by her side, Sahna's power was drastically diminished. She could still yell, she could still cry, she could still threaten, but her threats were hollow. The united front was broken. She was a queen without a kingdom, a general without an army. She had become isolated in her own rage. Think of the symbolism of marriage. It happened. After a decade of fighting, Jenny won. And she didn't win by convincing Sahna. She won by convincing Anil to simply stop, to give up the fight. And the groundwork for that surrender was laid not in loud arguments, but in quiet cups of tea and sympathetic listening sessions. It was a victory achieved not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments in between. This theory posits that Jenny Slatten is not the naive, love-struck woman she often appears to be. It suggests that beneath that exterior lies a shrewd political operator, a woman with a deep and intuitive understanding of human psychology. She saw the weakness in her enemy's alliance and exploited it masterfully. She understood that the way to defeat a powerful queen is to win the loyalty of her king, not by force, but by offering him the one thing his own queen could not: peace. It was a long, slow, and patient game. It required immense self-control. It required her to bite her tongue 1,000 times, to absorb insults, and to play a role. But in the end, her strategy paid off. She didn't just get her man, Sumit. She fractured the very foundation of the opposition that had stood in her way for a decade. She turned the father against the mother, not through malice or manipulation in the traditional sense, but through a campaign of relentless strategic kindness. She made herself the solution to a problem that her adversary, Sahna, was determined to perpetuate. The marital mutiny was a success. Anil had not officially switched sides, but he had abandoned his post, leaving his wife to fight a war all by herself. And a one-person war is not a war at all. It's just a tantrum. Jenny had won. The proof of this theory, the confirmation that Jenny's quiet campaign of sympathy and tea had successfully turned the tide, is not found in a single explosive confrontation. It is found in the slow drip of evidence, the small but seismic shifts in Anil's behavior that signaled his unofficial withdrawal from his wife's war. This was the judgment phase, not handed down from a judge's bench, but revealed in the quiet moments the cameras barely caught, and in the insider stories that fill in the gaps. The united front of Anil and Sahna didn't collapse with a bang. It crumbled from within, one silent act of rebellion at a time. Let's examine the first, and perhaps most crucial piece of evidence: Anil's verbal interventions. For years, his role during Sahna's tirades was one of silent, stoic support. His silence was his endorsement. It told everyone in the room, I stand with my wife. Her anger is my anger. But then we began to witness a change. During a particularly heated moment, with Sahna in full flight berating Jenny or Sumit, Anil would interject, but his words were not what we expected. He didn't say, Sumit, listen to your mother. He didn't say, Jenny, you are wrong. Instead, we would hear a quiet, weary phrase directed at his own wife. Sahna, leave her be. Or, Sahna, she is trying. Let us dissect the profound importance of these simple words. Sahna, leave her be. This is not a defense of Jenny's character. It's not an endorsement of the marriage. It is a direct command to his wife to cease hostilities. He is no longer supporting her attack. He is actively trying to shut it down. He has shifted from being her co-belligerent to being a peacekeeper. And in a war, the first person to call for peace is the one who has lost the will to fight. He was at that moment undermining his wife's authority in front of their son and daughter-in-law. He was telling her, your campaign of aggression is no longer my campaign. This constant fighting is the problem, not them. The target of his frustration was no longer Jenny, it was Sahna's behavior. Consider the phrase, she is trying. This is even more significant. For a decade, the narrative from the Singh parents was that Jenny was not trying. She was a destructive force, actively working against the family's traditions and happiness. For Anil to utter the words, she is trying, is a monumental concession. It means he has been watching her. It means her campaign of quiet respect, of serving tea, of listening has registered. He is acknowledging her effort. He is validating her actions over his wife's words. He is essentially saying, I see what you're doing, and it is not what my wife claims you are doing. In that small phrase, he is choosing Jenny's observed reality over Sahna's constructed narrative. This is the ultimate betrayal of Sahna's cause. He is no longer seeing Jenny through his wife's eyes. He is seeing her through his own. And what he sees is someone making an effort, someone contributing to peace rather than chaos. The next layer of evidence comes from what our insider sources describe as the back-channel agreements. These were the decisions made not in the open forum of a family screaming match, but in quiet one-on-one conversations between Anil and Sumit. The biggest example of this was Sumit and Jenny being allowed to attend certain family functions. On camera, we would see Sahna vehemently forbid it, declaring they would never be welcome. And yet, somehow, they would end up there. How did this happen? The theory is that Anil began to give his quiet, private permission. Sumit, emboldened by his father's changing attitude, would approach him alone. He would make his case, not in the heat of battle, but in a calm moment. And Anil, exhausted by the prospect of another fight with his wife, another scene, another round of tears and threats, would simply relent. He might have said, "Just come. Don't make a big deal. We will handle your mother." This is a classic move of a man trying to manage a difficult situation by avoiding conflict. But in doing so, he was committing an act of mutiny. He was actively conspiring with his son against his wife's stated wishes. He was forming a new secret alliance. He and Sumit, with Jenny as the silent partner, were now allied against Sahna's drama. Each time Sumit and Jenny showed up at an event Sahna had forbidden them from, it was a public display of her loss of power. Her decrees were being ignored, not just by her defiant son, but implicitly by her own husband. Anil's passive allowance was, in effect, an active choice. He chose the path of least resistance, and that path led directly over his wife's authority. He was not embracing Jenny, but he was abandoning his wife's war council. He had stopped enforcing her edicts, and an edict without an enforcer is just noise. Sahna was left looking like a raging monarch whose own royal guard had simply walked off the job. This leads to the deeper, more psychological evidence: Anil's complete and total emotional withdrawal from the conflict. In later seasons, watch his body language whenever Sahna begins one of her rants. In the early days, he would sit beside her, his posture rigid, his face a mask of stern agreement. He was a participant, but now observe him. He physically turns away. He looks at the floor. He rubs his eyes, the picture of exhaustion. He seems to shrink, to try and make himself invisible. This is not the body language of an ally. It is the body language of a hostage. He is a man trapped in a situation he no longer wants to be a part of. He has emotionally seceded from his wife's nation of rage. His silence, once a weapon of agreement, has now transformed into a tool of dissent. It is no longer a supportive silence, it is a weary, disapproving silence. It speaks volumes. It says, "I am not with her on this. I am not a part of this anymore. I am just waiting for it to be over." This emotional detachment was perhaps the most painful blow to Sahna. A screaming enemy is one thing. A silent, indifferent ally is something far worse. It's a vote of no confidence. It left her utterly and completely alone, stranded on an island of her own making, while her husband had quietly paddled away in a lifeboat provided by Jenny. The culmination of this long, quiet mutiny was, of course, the marriage itself. Sumit and Jenny finally tied the knot, not with a familial blessing, but in the vacuum of power created by Anil's withdrawal. Sahna's final, most powerful threat, the disownment of her son, became a bluff. Why? Because a threat like that requires a united front. She could not credibly disown Sumit if her own husband was not fully and completely behind her. And Anil, after years of Jenny's strategic campaign of kindness and his own mounting exhaustion, was no longer willing to pay the price of such a war. He would not sacrifice his relationship with his son and his own peace of mind just to satisfy his wife's vendetta. The marriage happened because Anil allowed it to happen. His inaction was the final decisive action. By refusing to stand with his wife in one last cataclysmic battle, he gave Sumit the green light. Sahna could scream, she could cry, she could lay on the floor, but the one person she needed to enforce her will had laid down his arms. The war was over, not because she had been defeated in battle, but because her main ally had deserted. And the architect of that desertion was Jenny, the woman who understood that the path to victory was not through the front gates, but through a quiet, secret tunnel dug directly into the general's quarters. This leaves Sahna in a tragic, isolated position. Jenny's strategy was so brilliant because it didn't just neutralize her, it fundamentally reframed her. For years, Sahna was the righteous, protective mother, defending her family's honor. But with Anil no longer standing by her side, her righteousness began to look like obsession. Her protection began to look like control. Her defense of tradition began to look like a personal, irrational hatred. Without Anil's silent endorsement, her behavior seemed unhinged. She was no longer one half of a parental unit. She was a singular, shrill voice of dissent in a family that was tired and ready to move on. Jenny achieved the ultimate victory. She didn't need Sahna's love or acceptance. She just needed her to be rendered irrelevant, and by winning Anil's passive support, she did just that. She isolated her adversary. She left Sahna with no one to fight but herself. Sahna could continue to rage, but her rage now fell on deaf ears. Her son was married, her husband was detached. The family, however fractured, had found a new grudging equilibrium. And Sahna was left outside of it, a victim of a war she thought she was winning, but a war in which her opponent had changed the rules, moved the battlefield, and captured her most valuable piece without her even noticing. So let's step back and look at the masterpiece of psychological warfare that Jenny Slatten has painted. She identified the weak link in the enemy alliance. She understood that Anil, the patriarch, was also a man under immense stress. She recognized that he craved peace more than he craved victory in his wife's holy war. She then executed a flawless, multi-year campaign to position herself not as the source of his stress, but as the solution to it. Phase 1, the ceasefire. She stopped fighting back, robbing Sahna of the conflict she needed to fuel her narrative. This made Sahna's aggression look one-sided and hysterical. Phase 2, the charm offensive. Not with grand gestures, but with the small, consistent rituals of respect and care, like the serving of tea. This non-verbally communicated deference and a desire for harmony, directly contradicting Sahana's portrait of her as a disruptive foreigner. Phase 3, the listening campaign. She created a safe space for Anil to vent his frustrations, never blaming his wife, but always validating his feelings of exhaustion. This forged a secret emotional bond between them, positioning them as fellow victims of the household drama. The result? The quiet mutiny. Anil, tired of the chaos and won over by Jenny's consistent offering of peace, withdrew his support for his wife's war. He did not switch sides. He simply left the battlefield. His small rebellions, the verbal interventions, the back-channel permissions, the emotional withdrawal, were the death knell for Sahna's campaign. This entire saga can be viewed as one of the most brilliant, long-term strategic maneuvers in the history of 90-Day Fiancé. It was a victory of soft power over hard power, of patience over passion, of emotional intelligence over brute emotional force. Jenny Slatten played the game on a level that nobody, least of all Sahna, even knew existed. She lost battle after battle, argument after argument, for years. She absorbed every blow, every insult. But all the while, she was patiently, methodically, working toward a single strategic objective, to win the war by securing the one ally who mattered. She couldn't win her mother-in-law's heart, so she neutralized her husband instead. But now, we must ask the ultimate question, the one that this entire theory hinges upon. Was this a deliberate, calculated, brilliant strategic move by a woman who is far more clever and manipulative than she appears? Was Jenny a quiet Machiavelli in a salwar kameez, consciously plotting every cup of tea, every sympathetic nod, every carefully chosen word, all as part of a grand divide-and-conquer scheme to secure her future with Sumit? Was this a cold and deliberate power play, executed with the precision of a master spy? Or is there a simpler, more human explanation? Could it be that what we witnessed was not a strategy, but a natural evolution of a relationship? Perhaps Jenny, genuinely tired of fighting, simply gave up arguing. Perhaps her gestures of kindness toward Anil were not a tactic, but a sincere attempt to find some peace and humanity in a difficult situation. Perhaps the bond that formed between them was not one of manipulator and target, but a genuine connection between two people, an older man and an older woman, both exhausted by the same relentless emotional storm, finding a moment of quiet understanding in the middle of the hurricane. Maybe she saw in him a fellow soul tired of the drama, and he saw in her a calm presence that he desperately needed. Was it a brilliant campaign or a natural bond? A calculated power play or a simple act of human survival? The truth, as always, is likely hidden somewhere in the nuances. But the outcome is undeniable. The united front of Anil and Sahna Singh is no more. Jenny Slatten is now Jenny Singh, and Sahna is left to rage against a war that is already over, a war she lost without ever truly understanding how. She couldn't win the war, so she won a key ally. Was this a brilliant strategic move by Jenny, or just a natural bond between two people tired of the drama? Let us know what you think of this incredible power play in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives that expose the hidden narratives and secret strategies behind your favorite 90-day stars, make sure you have liked this video, subscribed to the channel, and rung that notification bell. The truth is always more complicated and far more interesting than what you see on screen.